My name is Mirko Peters, and I translate how technology actually shapes business reality. Most leaders believe their biggest hurdles are found in strategy, budgets, or the people they hire. But if you look closely, the real drag sits somewhere else entirely. It lives inside a hidden process architecture that has slowly disappeared into messy Excel files, endless email chains, and private work habits. I want to use a company called Contoso Manufacturing as our through line today, not because they are unusual, but because their situation feels so incredibly normal. We are going to expose their shadow systems, map the specific patterns where they fail, and look at the governed path that actually leads out of the woods. If this is the kind of conversation you want to hear more of, hit subscribe, and let's start with what Contoso thinks is happening inside their walls. Contoso looks normal from the outside. From the outside, Contoso looks perfectly fine, and that is exactly why this matters so much for any growing business. They are a mid-sized company with capable managers, decent margins, and a technology stack that sounds respectable enough to put on a board slide. Microsoft 365 is fully deployed, their Teams channels stay busy, and Outlook is constantly overloaded with communication. There are shared drives and SharePoint sites everywhere, filled with spreadsheets with names like Final V7 approved use this one, while a leadership team feels, with some justification, that the business is moving in the right direction. If you walked through the building or joined a few of their meetings, you would probably agree that things are on track. People are not sitting around confused or idle because they are clearly working and their calendars stay packed from morning until night. Procurement is processing requests, finance is reviewing the latest numbers, and operations is busy tracking exceptions while HR chases down the next round of approvals. Sales is sending out forecasts and everyone can point to specific output, and because that output exists, the operating model feels much more stable than it actually is. But stability at the surface can easily hide fragility underneath because a company can look coordinated while the coordination itself is happening through invisible manual effort that nobody owns end to end. So let's stay with Contoso for a minute. A vacation request might start in one file and then move through email because a manager wants extra context before hitting approve. Procurement requests often begin with a spreadsheet attachment because the form in the old portal never got updated, and exception handling for supplier issues sits in someone's personal inbox because the official system cannot capture the extra notes people need. Weekly reporting gets assembled from multiple local files because every team keeps the version that works best for them, yet none of this feels dramatic on its own. Each workaround solves a real blockage in the moment, and that is exactly why these patterns survive and thrive. People do not wake up and decide to build a shadow system, but they will always remove friction wherever they find it to get the work through the door. If one team needs a data field that does not exist in the formal system, they simply add a new column in Excel. If an approval path changes too often to wait for an IT update, they route it through mail and memory instead. When leadership asks for a number by 4 o'clock, nobody pauses to redesign the architecture, so they copy, paste, reconcile, and send the deck. From a human perspective, this looks like responsible employees taking initiative. From an architectural perspective, it creates an operating layer that is real and business critical, yet almost completely ungoverned. And why is that? It happens because leadership usually sees individual tasks rather than the actual flow of work. They see that requests were approved, reports were produced, and customers were served, but they do not see how much hidden routing logic sits between those outcomes. They miss who forwarded the attachment, who renamed the file, and who remembered the specific threshold for a certain client. They don't see who chased the approver or who knew that if a specific plant manager was traveling, the request had to go to finance first, then procurement, and then back again. That logic exists, and it runs every single day, but it is stored in habits, inboxes, file paths, and the minds of a few trusted people. That means Contoso is not really running on process in the formal sense, but is instead running on hidden coordination. This is where a lot of leaders misread the situation because they look at a busy company and assume that busyness proves operating maturity. But busyness can also be a form of structural compensation, where the people inside the company are constantly filling gaps the architecture leaves open. They are translating between systems that do not connect, preserving context that the process does not carry, and rebuilding clarity every time work crosses a boundary. The business still moves, and that is the trap. Because when a company survives through invisible coordination, the output masks the design weakness. Leadership sees activity, the teams feel the pressure, the spreadsheets grow, and the inboxes fill. The company tells itself the same story many organizations tell, which is that they are a bit overloaded but basically functional. Actually, wait, let me clarify that. Contoso is functional, but it is functional in the way a building can still stand while more and more of its weight sits on temporary supports. If those supports are undocumented files, personal memory, and manual handoffs, then what looks efficient today can fail very quickly tomorrow. So this is not a story about a messy company, and it is not about poor discipline or lazy process owners. It is a company with competent people solving real work through an operating model that hides its own dependencies. Once we stop looking at isolated tasks and start looking at how work actually flows, the picture changes completely. The first signal, approval cycle time drift. Now we need to move from how things feel at Contoso to what the process is actually doing to the business. The first signal you'll notice is something I call approval cycle time drift. On paper, a procurement approval at a company like this should take somewhere between 24 and 48 hours. That sounds reasonable because a request comes in, the manager checks it, finance reviews the threshold, and procurement confirms the vendor before the order finally gets placed. If you asked anyone close to the operation, they would describe it exactly like that, as a short sequence with a few standard checks and a normal delay here and there. But when you measure the actual elapsed time instead of the intended time, a completely different picture starts to appear. That same approval that should close in a day or two is often taking 5, 7, or even 12 days to complete. This doesn't happen because one person refused to act or because the whole business stopped moving, and it's rarely because the request itself was unusually complex. The time simply disappears in the dark spaces between the steps where the work looks active from a distance but sits completely idle in practice. A typical request usually arrives as an email with a spreadsheet attached to it. The manager opens the file, notices one field is a bit unclear, and immediately forwards it back to the requester for clarification. Once the requester updates the file and changes the name, they send it back again, and the manager approves it but adds finance to the chain because the amount feels like it might hit a limit. Finance is stuck in meetings all afternoon, so they see the mail later and ask if this version is the latest one because another copy already arrived through a different chain. Procurement waits because they don't want to act on the wrong attachment, then someone goes on leave, and the whole thing stalls because nobody is fully sure who owns the next step. I want you to notice what actually happened in that sequence. The delay didn't come from one bad approver, but instead, it grew out of handoffs, inbox waiting, attachment forwarding, and the total absence of a single visible path. This is where many leaders misread cycle time because they hear that approvals are slow and assume the answer is to apply more pressure. They try to push managers harder, escalate response times, or send automated reminders, but reminders cannot fix invisible routing logic. The problem isn't the speed of effort, it's the speed of the architecture. When a process cannot hold its own state, the people inside it have to reconstruct that state manually every single time they touch a task. They have to ask if this is the latest file, if finance has seen it, or if the threshold was already checked. Since nobody wants to guess and risk a mistake, everybody hesitates just a little bit. That hesitation compounds across the entire chain, and what looked like a one-day process becomes a 7-day ordeal without any single dramatic failure occurring. From an executive perspective, this shift matters a lot because time drift is actually architecture drift. The business believes it operates with one clear approval model, but in reality, it operates with a loose collection of local interpretations stitched together by email behavior. The former process still exists as a diagram in a drawer, but the runtime process, the one that consumes days and money, lives somewhere else entirely. And this is why elapsed time is such a powerful signal for us to track. Time exposes hidden design flaws that people can usually hide behind extra effort for a short while. They can work late, they can chase answers, and they can manually route work around a blocked step, but they cannot hide what the clock records. If a 2-day process regularly takes 9 days to finish, your process architecture isn't just slightly inefficient, it is fundamentally unstable. There is another layer to this where the process appears busy while no real work is actually progressing. Emails are moving, attachments are circulating, and people are being copied on status discussions, but the request itself is just parked in a state of uncertainty. The organization experiences a lot of motion without any real throughput, which is one of the most expensive illusions a company can run on. Once time starts disappearing into handoffs like this, the cost doesn't stay hidden for long, it just shows up somewhere else in the system. The second signal, rework as a system outcome. At Contoso, that next place where the cost appears is in rework. This is our second signal, and in many ways, it tells us more than cycle time ever could. While a delay can still look like a simple scheduling problem, rework shows that the company is spending expensive effort to recreate work it already finished once. Think about what happens after a request finally manages to move forward. The data from the spreadsheet gets copied into another file for the finance review, and then procurement enters parts of that same information into a purchasing system because they don't trust the attachment as a source of record. A manager might edit one version locally while someone else updates an older copy from a different email thread. Eventually, the numbers don't match. So somebody has to stop everything to compare cells, check timestamps, and rebuild the request history by hand. Nothing in that entire sequence creates any new value for the company. It is just a system repairing its own losses. And that is why I want to frame this carefully. Rework is often described as simple sloppiness. We blame someone for keying the wrong amount, using an old file, or forgetting the latest comments. But if the same kinds of mistakes happen again and again across different functions, it stops being a personal issue and becomes a design issue. It's a system outcome. At Contoso, this pattern shows up in version conflicts, manual data re-entry, and constant copying and pasting between different tools. You see it in parallel edits happening in separate files and late-stage corrections when finance realizes the attachment doesn't match the email. Manager reviews get repeated constantly because the original context was stripped out somewhere during the transit. If you measured it honestly, you would probably find that 15 to 30% of the work is being redone in some form. This doesn't happen because people are careless, but because the process does not preserve state cleanly as work moves from one step to the next. That distinction is vital for a leader to understand. A good process carries context forward automatically, but a weak process sheds context at every handoff and then asks the people inside it to reconstruct what was already known. So when leaders ask why a team keeps touching the same request 3 times, the better translation is that the team isn't slow, the system is just making them repeat themselves. Once you see that, a lot of management frustration starts to make much more sense. Finance keeps asking for the same clarification because that information stayed in someone's private inbox instead of staying with the process. Procurement keeps checking thresholds manually because that logic lives in old policy documents and human memory rather than in the digital runtime. Managers feel buried in small approvals because every incomplete handoff sends ambiguous work back upstream for them to fix. The people inside the system are not just doing the work, they are constantly compensating for a missing structure. This is one of the most expensive forms of waste because it spreads quietly and rarely appears as a clean line item on a budget. Nobody writes reconstructed context into a monthly operating report, and nobody creates a dashboard for hours lost comparing attachments. But the cost is very real, and it lands in labor, delay, error correction, and management attention all at once. I've seen this pattern in enough organizations to know that rework often gets misdiagnosed as a training problem. We tell ourselves to train people harder, add another checklist, or remind teams to use the right file names. But if the architecture still depends on file copies and manual transfers, then training just becomes another form of structural compensation. You are trying to force discipline onto a fragile path instead of just fixing the path itself. From a system perspective, that's not just inefficient, it's fragile. Every repeated touch point creates another chance for a mismatch, another chance for a delay, and another chance for the business to lose confidence in what it thinks it knows. This is where rework starts changing from an operations problem into a trust problem. When the same request gets handled twice or interpreted differently in 2 different files, people stop trusting the numbers. That shift matters more than most leaders realize because once work gets done twice often enough, the next thing that breaks isn't speed. It's the confidence in the operating picture itself. The third signal, data inconsistency, becomes trust failure. Once confidence in the work itself starts to weaken, the next thing you need to watch is the data. This is the third signal, and at a company like Contoso, the same business unit can produce 3 different answers to the exact same question without anyone trying to manipulate the results. That is what makes this problem so difficult to spot at first, because the issue isn't bad intent, it's actually a combination of bad timing, source confusion, and process fragmentation. Imagine the leadership team asks a simple question about the current procurement backlog and how much of it sits outside the policy threshold. Operations pulls a number from the spreadsheet used by their coordinators, while finance brings a different figure from the monthly reconciliation file, and procurement has a third number because their team filtered the late requests based on the version they trust most. All 3 groups are acting in good faith and can explain their logic, yet all 3 groups can still be wrong in relation to each other. That is the exact moment when a management meeting stops being about making decisions and turns into a reconciliation meeting. The conversation shifts to which Excel file is correct, who updated a specific tab, and why finance shows 27 open requests while procurement shows 34. People start asking if the exceptions were already counted or if those are still sitting in Sarah's tracker, and they wonder if the data was extracted before or after the manager approvals came in yesterday afternoon. Once those questions become the norm, the company is no longer dealing with simple reporting friction, it is dealing with a total trust failure in its operating picture. This is a serious shift because businesses do not run on data alone, they run on shared confidence in what that data means right now and whether everyone in the room is looking at the same reality. If that confidence drops, decisions slow down, even when the reports still arrive on time, and the result is a system where people hedge more and constantly ask for another validation. They defer action until someone can check the numbers, and eventually they stop trusting the process and start trusting familiar individuals instead. In a healthy architecture, the report settles the question, but in a shadow system, the report is just the start of the argument. Now map that to what work actually feels like inside Contoso, where finance spends extra time validating line items before closing a monthly view. And operations keeps a local file because they don't trust the shared one to reflect late exceptions. Managers ask analysts for the real number, which usually just means the version adjusted by someone with the right context. So even when dashboards exist, they sit on top of unstable inputs. The presentation looks digital, but the coordination underneath is still manual, and this is where leaders often underestimate the true cost. They look at inconsistent numbers and think the answer is abstract data governance or cleaner definitions, but if the process generating that data still depends on email attachments and local copies, then Inconsistency is a runtime problem. The process cannot produce one trusted record because it was never built to preserve one, and the consequence goes far beyond executive frustration. Audit exposure starts rising, compliance conversations get harder, and the exception history becomes almost impossible to reconstruct. Nobody can show cleanly and quickly who changed what or when it happened. So when an auditor asks for the trail behind a threshold exception, the company doesn't retrieve the answer from architecture, it assembles the answer from fragments. That is expensive, and it is also incredibly risky. When evidence depends on memory, inbox searches, and file archaeology, control is mostly performative, and the company may feel governed because responsible people are involved, but the underlying process isn't carrying the load. The people are. This creates another structural shift where trust in the data drops and people rely on the analyst who always knows the right number or the coordinator who understands the file. On the surface, that looks like expertise, but from a system perspective, it is something else entirely. It is concentration. And concentration is risk because the business is no longer running on an observable process. It is running on memory, interpretation, and a few human bridges holding the entire picture together. The hidden metric nobody tracks, key person dependency. This brings us to a metric that almost nobody tracks in a serious way, even though it tells you more about operational resilience than half the dashboards most companies review every month. Key person dependency does not show up as a formal KPI at Contoso, and nobody puts it on the board pack or labels it as a risk until something finally breaks. But everyone inside the company knows it exists because they use the same sentence every shadow system eventually produces. Only Sarah understands this spreadsheet. You can swap Sarah for any other name, but the pattern stays the same where one person knows which tab matters and remembers the logic behind the colors. One person understands why the number in column H doesn't match the report unless you exclude a certain supplier group, and they know which approval path changed last quarter even if that change was never fully documented. The file looks shared, but the understanding is concentrated, and from a system perspective, that is a single point of failure. The reason companies tolerate this for so long is simple. In the short term, concentration looks efficient. If Sarah can resolve questions quickly and fix the broken formulas, the business experiences her as highly capable, which she probably is. But capability and resilience are not the same thing, and a company can be grateful for expertise while still being structurally fragile because that expertise sits in only one place. Now map that to business reality and imagine Sarah takes leave for 2 weeks, gets promoted, or moves to another team. Suddenly, a workflow that felt inconvenient but manageable becomes unstable very fast, and requests wait longer because nobody knows which file drives the current month. Finance hesitates because the formulas do not reconcile, and managers send more messages because the status is unclear, leading the organization to discover that what looked like process discipline was really just human memory standing in for architecture. I believe leaders need to stop treating concentrated knowledge as a sign of maturity because concentration is not expertise, it is fragility when the process depends on it to function. This doesn't reduce the value of skilled people, but it changes what we ask the architecture to carry. And in a resilient company, people add judgment and context rather than acting as the only place where process knowledge lives. If the spreadsheet, the inbox, and the person all have to stay in sync for the business to move, then the company has not built redundancy, it has built dependence. Systems without redundancy do not scale well, and they break under pressure because every increase in volume or urgency puts more load on the same human bridge. At Contoso, you can already see the symptoms as people wait for certain individuals before closing decisions or meetings get delayed because we need her number first. Approvals slow down when one manager is traveling because nobody is sure which exception path applies, and local workarounds multiply around trusted people, which only makes them more central to the problem. The irony is that the company often celebrates the people who hold the shadow system together while ignoring the fact that needing heroes at all is a design warning. From an executive view, the implication is direct. Resilience is low even when the output still looks acceptable. The business may be shipping and reporting, but it is doing it through concentration risk that stays invisible until absence exposes it. And once that becomes normal, the company is no longer running on process. It is running on memory. It's memory in files, memory in naming habits, and memory in people who carry undocumented assumptions from one week to the next. Which brings me to the next question, because if this pattern is so fragile, why do smart teams keep rebuilding it anyway? Why smart people keep rebuilding the same workaround? So why does this keep happening, even when the pain is obvious to almost everyone involved? The answer is simple. The workaround works, at least in the moment. That is the part leaders often underestimate when they look at process architecture. Excel survives inside large companies not because people are irrational, but because a spreadsheet is fast, available, familiar, and politically easy to deploy. It is already there on every desktop. Nobody needs a 3-month procurement cycle just to open a blank workbook. And nobody needs a steering committee to add a tab, change a column, or forward a file to 3 people with a note saying to use this version going forward. The barrier to action is almost zero which means the business can respond to friction immediately rather than waiting for a formal roadmap. And when people are under pressure, immediate relief usually beats structural repair. That is not a character flaw in your employees. It is a predictable system response. If a team needs a data field that the existing enterprise tool does not support, they will not wait 3 months for a backlog slot just to protect architectural purity. They will add the field somewhere else. If a manager needs visibility into an approval status this afternoon, someone will build a manual tracker to get the answer. If finance needs a threshold check before the month-end close, somebody will create a formula and share the file across the department. The business reaches for the thing that removes friction now, not the thing that creates a clean operating structure 6 months from now. That is why shadow systems spread through competent organizations so easily. The people inside them are solving real constraints with the tools they can access fastest. And why is that? Because demand moves faster than formal delivery in most growing companies. The business changes quickly, exceptions appear, policies shift, and reporting asks multiply while customers pressure timelines and leadership wants answers now. But the official path for process change usually moves through prioritization meetings, resource limits, security reviews, and long release cycles. So the organization develops two speeds, the formal speed and the survival speed. Excel lives in the gap between them. That is why I keep calling this structural compensation. We are not watching careless teams ignore a process, but rather we are watching the company compensate for the fact that its formal delivery model cannot keep up with its operating reality. The spreadsheet becomes a pressure valve, the inbox becomes a routing engine, and the person becomes the integration layer. Because the immediate problem gets solved, the workaround earns legitimacy and eventually hardens into the new standard. Then it becomes permanent. A local tracker becomes the real tracker. A temporary file becomes the operational source of truth. An unofficial approval chain becomes the one everyone actually trusts. And after a while, nobody even describes it as a workaround anymore because it just becomes how the company works on a daily basis. That normalization is what makes this so hard to unwind. Once a workaround has history, people start defending it for rational reasons. They know where the formulas sit, they trust the outputs they have learned to interpret, and they fear disruption more than they fear fragility. Fragility is still mostly invisible on normal days, while disruption is immediate and public. So even smart people who know this is not ideal keep rebuilding the same pattern because it is still the shortest path from blockage to motion. From a business angle, local optimization keeps winning over structural clarity. And local optimization is seductive because it produces fast relief while pushing complexity outward to other departments. The team that fixes its own issue today often transfers risk to the wider business tomorrow, such as when a spreadsheet helps procurement move but leaves finance with another version to reconcile. The email loop helps operations escalate a problem, but nobody else can see the status cleanly. And the manual patch helps one manager control risk while the company loses its shared operating picture. So the workaround feels efficient where it is built, even while it weakens the architecture around it. That is why telling people to stop using Excel rarely works. You are trying to remove compensation before the underlying constraint is addressed. If the official route still feels slow, opaque, or hard to change, people will simply rebuild the shadow path somewhere else. Maybe not in Excel, but in Teams chats, SharePoint lists, personal notes, or small apps with no oversight. The form changes, but the pattern stays. And once you see that, the next part becomes unavoidable. This is not just a business discipline problem, it is a backlog problem. Because the reason these workarounds keep winning is that the central response is too slow to absorb the demand the business is already generating. Why central IT cannot solve this by itself. So now we get to the part where a lot of leaders reach for the obvious answer. They assume that because the spreadsheets spread due to a lack of structure, central IT should step in, clean it up, rebuild the process properly, and pull everything back under control. That sounds sensible on paper. It also breaks on contact with how most companies actually operate. Because central IT is not failing here because the people are weak or the intentions are wrong, but rather because central IT is usually overloaded for structural reasons. Demand grows across every function at once, with procurement needing a workflow fix and finance wanting cleaner controls while HR needs better intake and operations wants exception handling. All of it arrives through one funnel that was never built to absorb every process change the business can generate. So queues form. Then the queue becomes the real process. A request for a small workflow improvement waits behind a larger platform project, and a departmental pain point gets classified as important but not urgent. A workaround looks temporary, so it never beats the project with high budget visibility. And the business learns very quickly that asking for formal delivery means waiting longer than the problem will tolerate. That is the point where people stop waiting, not because they reject IT, because the work still has to move. If a team has to choose between architectural correctness in 4 months or operational movement this afternoon, they will usually choose movement. That choice is rational inside the local context, even when it creates wider risk for the organization. So they build around the backlog with files, inboxes, and manual routing, and each local fix becomes evidence that the business can survive without formal delivery for at least one more quarter. But survival is not scale, and this is where central IT gets trapped. The more the business works around the queue, the less visible the real demand becomes. IT sees fewer formal requests than the company actually needs, while the business sees IT as too slow to matter for process-level change. That gap widens over time, and both sides start telling incomplete stories to justify their positions. IT says to submit a request and follow the process. The business says they did that before, and by the time the solution came back, the problem had already changed. Both are telling the truth from where they sit, but the design between them is broken. Now map that to a company like Contoso. Procurement does not need a 2-year transformation program to fix one approval path, and finance does not need a major ERP initiative to gain a clean audit trail on threshold exceptions. HR does not need a custom development team to remove email from a simple request flow, because these are not always big software problems. Often they are medium-sized process problems trapped inside large delivery machinery. So when leaders ask why shadow systems keep appearing, I think the answer is plain. Citizen development already exists, but it is just happening in the least governable places possible. In Excel, in email, in private logic no one can inspect. That means the real strategic question is not whether the business will build, because the business is already building every single day. The real question is where that building happens, under what rules, with what visibility, and with what escalation path when the risk level changes. This is why central IT cannot solve the issue by itself. Not because IT should step back, because IT acting alone as the single delivery engine for every process adaptation becomes another single point of failure. From a system perspective, that model does not remove shadow systems. It produces them. The queue creates the workaround. The workaround creates hidden architecture. Hidden architecture creates risk. And then leadership asks IT to clean up a mess the delivery model helped generate in the first place. So the answer cannot be pure centralization, but it also cannot be unmanaged freedom, because then you just rebuild the same problem with shinier tools and faster mistakes. What we need is a different operating stance, one that accepts business-led building as normal, accepts governance as necessary, and stops pretending that one central backlog can carry the full adaptive load of a modern company. Which means the next step is to name the architecture honestly, because once we do that, Excel stops looking like a harmless tool choice and starts looking like what it really became, an unofficial process runtime. The Excel shadow system explained as architecture, so let's name this properly. What the team at Contoso built isn't just a messy collection of files, it's an architecture. It might be unofficial and brittle, but it still performs every core function a real operating system has to handle. It captures inputs, routes work, stores the current state, and distributes information to the right people. It even handles exceptions and produces final outputs. The only real difference is that it does all of this without any governance, visibility, or a reliable way to control the outcome. That distinction matters, because if we keep blaming Excel for the problem, we're staying too close to the surface. Excel isn't the problem on its own. The problem is using Excel as a process runtime. A spreadsheet used for a quick analysis or a temporary calculation is perfectly normal. It's fine to use a file to model scenarios, compare options, or just inspect some data. But once that file becomes the only place where the process state lives, where approvals are just inferred, and where version history has to stand in for a real audit trail, the file is no longer just a tool. It has become infrastructure, and it's not the kind of infrastructure you want to rely on. Now, map the architecture at Contoso in plain terms. The file acts like a database, but it lacks any reliable state management. The inbox acts like a workflow engine, yet it has no enforced routing logic to keep things moving. Most importantly, the people end up acting like integration layers because they have to move context from one tool to another using nothing but memory and habit. That is the shadow system in one sentence. Files become unofficial databases, inboxes become workflow engines, and people become the middleware. Once you see it that way, the business risk is much easier to explain. There is no stable source of truth because the state of the work is fragmented across a dozen hard drives. There is no clean access model because files get forwarded based on whoever is available at the moment. There isn't even any real policy logic because thresholds and exceptions live entirely in the interpretation of the person reading the email. You can't find a trustworthy audit trail because the evidence is scattered across attachments, replies, and side conversations. So when leaders say, but the process exists, I think the better answer is yes, it exists, but the runtime is happening entirely outside the governed layer. That creates a very specific kind of business illusion where the company looks digital on the surface. People are using laptops, they work in Microsoft 365, and reports arrive on time for meetings. But underneath that digital surface, the core coordination is still analog. It relies on manual routing, manual checking, and manual interpretation. The technology stack looks modern, but the process behavior is still dependent on hand-carried context. And this is why the phrase shadow system is so useful. It isn't just hidden work, it is hidden architecture. This is an operating layer the business depends on every day, but it's one they cannot properly see, measure, or secure. And why is that dangerous? Because architecture doesn't stop affecting business outcomes just because it's unofficial. The company still pays for every weakness in that design. It pays in delays when the state of a project is unclear, and it pays in rework when context gets lost between steps. It pays in compliance risk when evidence can't be reconstructed, and it pays in concentration risk when one person becomes the only translator for the whole system. The system is doing exactly what it was set up to do. It just isn't set up for what the business actually needs right now. That is why I want to remove blame from the conversation for a moment. The Excel shadow system isn't proof that Contoso hired careless people. It's proof that the business built an operating layer faster than its formal architecture could evolve to support it. That is a system outcome. Demand kept moving and work had to flow. So the company assembled a runtime from the tools they had closest at hand. It was useful at first, but it's fragile at scale. Once we say that clearly, the conversation improves. We stop asking how to stop people from using spreadsheets and start asking what architecture should carry this process instead. That is a much better question because it shifts the discussion from tool preference to operating design. Once we name the shadow system as architecture, we can finally compare it with a governed one. What power platform changes at the structural level? So once we name the shadow system honestly, the next question is straightforward. What changes when Contoso stops running processes through files and mail and starts running them through a governed power platform architecture? The first change isn't cosmetic, it is structural. Power Platform shifts the company from hidden manual coordination to observable process behavior. That sounds technical, but the business effect is simple. Work stops depending on people to carry the state from one step to the next because the architecture starts carrying more of that load itself. Take Power Apps first. Instead of a request beginning as an email with a few unwritten assumptions, Power Apps gives the business a structured entry point. Required fields are enforced, inputs are guided, and roles only see what they need to see. The requester doesn't have to guess which version of a spreadsheet to use, and the receiving team doesn't have to reconstruct intent from a messy email. The process starts with cleaner data because the architecture shapes the interaction at the front door. That alone changes a lot. Many downstream problems don't actually begin downstream. They begin at intake, where ambiguity enters the process and then spreads like a virus. Then you add Power Automate. This is where routing stops living in habit and starts living in logic that the business can actually inspect. Approval paths can follow specific thresholds or departments, and notifications happen because the process changed state, not because somebody remembered to forward a message. Escalations trigger automatically based on elapsed time, which makes ownership and waiting times visible to everyone. Now the company can see whether a request is pending manager review or a finance validation. That is a world away from sending messages around asking if anyone knows where a specific file went. From a process perspective, Power Automate turns invisible coordination into orchestration. Once orchestration is visible, management gets a different kind of control. It isn't control through chasing people, it's control through design. Then there is Power BI. A lot of people treat Power BI as just a reporting layer, and while it is that, it matters here because it gives the business shared visibility into the flow. You can see the backlog, the aging, and the bottlenecks without debating which local file represents reality. The company can monitor the operating picture from the process itself. That doesn't remove every data problem overnight, but it changes the direction of trust. The process starts producing a common picture instead of forcing people to reconcile competing ones after the fact. And where it's needed, Dataverse and connected Microsoft 365 services provide a governed data layer underneath all of this. I want to be careful here because not every process needs Dataverse on day one. But structurally, the option matters. It means the business has a place for managed data and policy-aware storage when the process calls for it. That is a very different foundation from scattering business-critical information across attachments and local copies. So the shift isn't really from Excel to Power Platform as tools. It is a shift from an unofficial runtime to a governed runtime. That is the entire point. The file no longer acts like a database, the inbox no longer acts like the workflow engine, and the person no longer acts like the integration layer. Instead, the company starts moving towards structured intake, rule-based orchestration, and shared visibility. That creates something the shadow system could never offer consistently. Observable flow. Observable flow means you can see where work sits and why it stalled. You know who owns the next action and which exceptions keep repeating. You can finally see whether the architecture is actually supporting the business or forcing people to compensate for its failures. Once you can see that, improvement stops being guesswork. And this is why I don't frame Power Platform as a tool story. It is an operating architecture story. Contoso isn't just replacing spreadsheets. They are redesigning where process logic lives and where management gets visibility. Speed improves, of course, but the deeper gain is that the business starts running on an architecture it can actually govern. To make that concrete, we need to stop speaking in general terms and look at one specific process inside Contoso, because that is where the structural difference becomes impossible to ignore. The procurement approval process before redesign. Let's take one specific process and look at it under a microscope, because this is the exact moment where architecture stops being a slide deck and starts being a reality. At Contoso, the procurement approval process sounds completely harmless when you describe it in a meeting. Someone needs to buy something, so they send a request, the manager signs off, finance checks the numbers, and procurement confirms the vendor before the order moves. That is the story people tell themselves, and on a whiteboard it looks clean enough to pass for a controlled business system. But the lived process is a different animal entirely. A requester starts their day by hunting for the latest spreadsheet template, or at least what they hope is the latest version, usually digging through old emails, buried Teams chats, or a shared folder containing 5 files with nearly identical names. They manually enter the supplier, the cost center, the expected cost, and the business justification. Because different teams have learned to tolerate different gaps over the years, some fields stay empty and then they just attach that file to an email and fire it off to their manager. That very first step creates immediate system instability because the process doesn't start in a controlled environment. It starts with file discovery and local interpretation, which means the foundation is built on whatever the requester happens to find in their inbox that morning. Then the manager opens that attachment to see what's going on. If the request looks simple, they might just hit reply with a quick approved. But if the price tag looks high, they might loop in finance or ask procurement a few informal questions before they commit. If a single field is missing, the file gets bounced back, and sometimes the manager just edits the spreadsheet themselves or leaves a few cryptic comments in the body of the email. At this point, the request has already fragmented across 3 or 4 different channels. The spreadsheet holds a little bit of the truth, the email thread holds another piece of the story, and the people involved are forced to carry the rest of the status in their own heads. From there, the 6-step approval path at Contoso doesn't actually run on enforced logic, but rather it runs on tribal knowledge and habit. There is a manager review, a finance threshold check, and a procurement validation, along with occasional visits to legal or operations depending on what is being ordered. Everyone in the building can explain the general flow, but the actual route the file takes depends on individual judgment calls and whoever happens to notice a missing detail. This means that status is never truly visible at a system level. The person who submitted the request has no idea if their file is waiting for a signature sitting in a threshold review or just buried under 100 other unread messages in someone's inbox. To get an answer, they have to chase it manually by sending follow-ups, making phone calls, and asking colleagues if they've seen the request lately. Approvers often reply without knowing the full history, finance receives outdated versions of the file, and procurement eventually pauses the whole thing because the numbers don't reconcile. This is where the system starts burning management capacity far beyond the value of the actual transaction. A standard purchase request should never require this much detective work to complete. At Contoso, detective work was the only way things got done. Because there is no validation at the front door, downstream teams are constantly finding problems far too late in the game. The vendor name is wrong, the budget estimate was off, or the business reason is too vague for a policy review, and so the request loops backward. This isn't a rare exception, but a regular feature of the environment. When the leadership at Contoso finally sat down to measure this mess honestly, 3 specific numbers told the whole story. The average cycle time was 9 days. The rework rate sat at 22%. Visibility was effectively 0 unless someone decided to personally investigate the paper trail. That specific combination is important because it explains why a broken process can survive for years. It worked just well enough to keep the lights on, and because orders eventually went through and teams compensated for the friction, the business kept moving. When a system still delivers an output, even a bad one, nobody feels the urge to redesign it until the hidden cost of that friction becomes impossible to ignore. Before they touched a single line of code, this is what procurement at Contoso actually was. It wasn't a governed process, but a loosely connected chain of files, emails, and social pressure that only held together because the people inside were carrying the weight that the architecture dropped. The procurement approval process after redesign. Now let's look at what happens when you change the architecture instead of trying to change the people. Contoso didn't start this journey by launching a massive transformation program that promised to change the world. They started with one process, one owner, and one governed environment, with the very specific goal of stopping email and spreadsheets from acting as the system's engine. The first thing you notice is that the entry point has completely changed. Instead of hunting through folders for a template, the requester opens a Power App designed specifically for procurement intake. The fields are structured and the rules are hard-coded, so the required information is enforced the moment someone hits submit, rather than being discovered 3 days later by a frustrated finance clerk. Supplier details, cost centers, and business justifications all enter through one controlled front door, and if a request is incomplete, it doesn't drift into the system half-formed. That single shift removes a massive amount of noise from the system because ambiguity is no longer allowed to enter the workflow disguised as progress. Once that data is in, Power Automate takes over the path that the inbox used to try and improvise. Approval routing is no longer a matter of habit or who happens to be copied on a thread. The flow automatically checks the dollar amount, the request type, and the business area against the latest policy conditions. A low-value order might just go to a manager, while a high-threshold request triggers a finance review, and a supplier exception might branch off into a legal check without anyone needing to remember the rules. The logic is now visible, it is repeatable, and most importantly, it is reviewable by anyone with the right access. This matters because for the first time, the process actually knows where it is. The system can tell the requester and the owner exactly where the bottleneck is, whether it's pending a manager's signature or sitting in exception handling. Nobody has to reconstruct the history of a request from scattered signals anymore because the architecture carries that state as a primary function. Since the architecture is now doing the heavy lifting, the way the team handles escalations changes as well. If a request sits idle for too long, the flow sends a notification to the right person based on the actual time elapsed. If an approval takes longer than the target window, that delay becomes a data point in the system rather than just a source of frustration for the person waiting. If a submission needs a correction, that work happens inside the governed path instead of spawning a new version of a file and a sidechain of confusing emails. Then you layer Power BI on top of that foundation. For the first time in the company's history, Contoso can see their procurement process as a living picture of their operations instead of a monthly post-mortem. They can see the backlog, the aging requests, and the approval bottlenecks in near real time, which allows finance to see exactly where the threshold delays are happening. Leaders no longer have to guess if the process is actually getting faster or if they've just moved the queue to a different department. This fundamentally shifts the management conversation because meetings no longer start with a debate over which spreadsheet is the most recent. Instead, the conversation starts with where the friction is located and what the flow data is telling them about the system's health. Within 90 days of making these changes, the results were no longer just a theory on a slide. The average cycle time crashed from 9 days down to just 2.5. Rework fell below 5% because the data was clean from the start. The audit trail became a permanent part of the record, showing exactly who approved what and when the request moved from one stage to the next. But here's the most important part of the story. Contoso didn't need any more heroics from their staff to make this work. They didn't need a specific person to stay late to keep a file alive, and they didn't need requesters to spend their afternoons chasing status updates or managers to guess the next step from a buried email thread. The work still involved human beings and their judgment still mattered, but the people inside the process were no longer acting as the glue holding the whole thing together. That is the structural difference. The architecture now carries the coordination load, which means the business can move faster without losing control, and it can maintain control without slowing everyone down with manual checks. When I hear leaders look at a project like this and say they automated approvals, I think they are missing the real point of the transformation. What Contoso actually did was move from a world of hidden coordination to a world of governed flow. Once you make that shift, the business is no longer just surviving through invisible human effort, but it is operating through an architecture that the leadership can finally see and manage. So this is not automation for its own sake. Now, this is where a lot of leaders misread what just changed at Contoso because they look at the outcome and reduce it to a familiar phrase: we automated the approvals. That is true, but it is incomplete. If all you see is speed, you miss the structural gain. The deeper change is not that requests move faster. The deeper change is that the business can finally see the flow it depends on, and once flow becomes visible, management stops operating through guesswork, memory, and escalation theater. That matters because automation on its own can still create a mess. You can automate a bad path, you can speed up the wrong handoff, and you can push broken logic through a faster channel and call it progress. I've seen that happen more than once. A company replaces email with a flow but keeps unclear ownership, or it builds an app while the policy rules still live inside documents and tribal knowledge. Work moves faster for a while, yet the core ambiguity stays in place. The interface changed, but the operating truth did not. That is not what happened in the Contoso redesign. What changed was not just the amount of manual effort, but where certainty actually came from. Before the redesign, certainty came from people checking, asking, reconciling, and remembering. After the redesign, more certainty comes from architecture. The intake carries structure, the routing carries logic, the reporting carries shared visibility, and the audit trail carries evidence. So yes, cycle time dropped, and that matters. Yes, rework fell, and that matters too. But from a leadership perspective, the bigger gain is that the company no longer needs to spend management energy figuring out what the process is doing. The process starts revealing that directly. That reduces a kind of noise most businesses normalize without noticing. Status chasing, clarification loops, reconciliation meetings, manual escalations caused by uncertainty instead of real exception. Those things feel small when viewed one by one, but taken together, they drain attention from the people who should be improving the business instead of decoding it. And why is that? Because ambiguity creates management load. When ownership is unclear, leaders intervene. When state is unclear, analysts investigate. When policy application is unclear, teams pause and ask for interpretation. So a weak process does not only waste frontline time, it climbs upward into coordination overhead where the cost gets more expensive fast. This is why I do not think the right contrast is automation versus manual work. The right contrast is ambiguity versus governed flow. Automation removes waiting where the step is already understood. Governance removes uncertainty about who acts, under which rule, with which evidence, and in what state the work currently sits. That combination changes the business conversation. Instead of asking, can we move this faster, leaders can ask better questions. Where do requests age most? Which exception paths repeat too often? Which thresholds create avoidable delay? Where is policy generating friction because the logic is unclear? That is a different level of control, not control through pressure, but control through observability. And once a company gets that, speed and control stop looking like competing goals. In the Excel shadow system, they usually do compete. If you want speed, you bypass control, and if you want control, you add checks and create more delay. The business learns to treat governance as drag. In a governed architecture, that trade-off softens. Control can travel inside the flow. Required fields, access boundaries, approval logic, timestamps, exception handling, and reporting do not have to sit outside the process as extra layers of friction. They can sit inside the architecture that runs the work. That is why this is not automation for its own sake. It is structural clarification. It is the business moving from hidden coordination to visible operations. And once leaders see that clearly, the next mistake becomes easier to avoid. Because giving people low-code tools without an operating model does not remove shadow systems. It just rebuilds them at higher speed. Why low-code fails when organizations scale tools instead of architecture. So now we get to the objection that shows up almost every time this conversation becomes serious. We tried low-code before and it didn't scale. I take that objection seriously because in a lot of companies it is true. People did build apps, flows did spread, and a few teams moved fast. Then 6 months later, nobody knew which solution mattered, who owned what, which connectors were in use, what data was exposed, or how anything should move from experiment to production. The result looked like progress for a while, then felt like another mess to clean up. But if you look closely, low-code did not fail there. Architecture failed there, or more precisely, the company scaled tools without scaling the operating model around them. That distinction matters because otherwise leaders learn the wrong lesson. They see app sprawl, weak ownership, and inconsistent quality, then conclude the platform created chaos. In most cases, the platform only exposed the pattern that already existed. The business was already improvising outside formal delivery, and low-code just gave that improvisation a faster and more visible form. So the problem is not that people can build. The problem is that people can build into a vacuum. No life cycle, no environment strategy, no clear ownership, no review path for risk, no shared standards for naming, connectors, support, or retirement. And once those conditions are missing, the business recreates the same shadow system we saw with Excel, only now it happens through apps and flows instead of files and inboxes. That is why I think leaders need to be very careful with the sentence, "We scaled low code." In many organizations, what actually happened is simpler. They scaled access, but they did not scale architecture. And those are not the same thing. Access means more people can create. Architecture means creation happens inside boundaries that preserve trust, supportability, and visibility as volume grows. Without that second layer, success contains the seed of failure. The better the tools get, the faster unmanaged expansion happens. One department builds a useful app, another copies the idea without understanding the connector risk, and a third automates a local approval but stores business logic in 3 different places. Soon, there are many moving parts, yet no common view of what is live, what is risky, what is duplicated, and what should never have reached production. From a system perspective, that is not democratization, it is unmanaged distribution. And unmanaged distribution breaks for the same reasons shadow systems break. State fragments, ownership blurs, evidence weakens, support becomes personal, risk spreads faster than visibility. So, when someone tells me low-code did not scale in their company, I usually want to ask one question first. What exactly scaled, the platform or the permissions? Because if the answer is mostly permissions, then the outcome was almost predictable. Now map that back to business reality. A team builds an app because the backlog is too slow, and another team builds a similar app because they never knew the first one existed. A manager leaves and nobody knows who owns the flow, or a connector gets used in a way security never reviewed. An app solves a real problem but cannot be trusted across the business because nobody knows its lifecycle. That is not a low-code failure. That is a governance vacuum. And once you name it that way, the path forward gets clearer. The answer is not to pull the tools back and force everything into one central queue again. That would only push building back into hidden places. The answer is to make business-led building legitimate, visible, and bounded, which means low-code only works at scale when the architecture around it answers a few basic questions. Who can build what, in which environment, against which data, with which review, owned by whom, supported how, retired when? If those answers stay vague, the platform becomes another acceleration layer for confusion. If those answers become clear, then low-code stops behaving like a risk amplifier and starts behaving like a governed extension of delivery capacity. So the lesson is not be careful with low-code. The lesson is do not confuse tool rollout with operating design. Because if you scale tools without architecture, you get faster shadow systems. If you scale architecture with the tools, you get something very different. You get a platform the business can trust. And governance is not restriction, it is making scale safe. We need to have a more mature conversation about this because the word governance still triggers a defensive reaction in most boardrooms. When people hear that word, they don't think of safety. They imagine a massive slowdown filled with extra approval layers, endless forms, and more people saying no. They see a growing distance between the problem they have and the fix they need. If that is what governance looks like inside your organization, I completely understand why your teams are resisting it. But we have to be honest, that isn't governance working correctly, it's just bureaucracy trying to compensate for a lack of trust. Good governance does something very different by making scale safe for everyone involved. That should be the only standard we care about. It isn't about control for its own sake or performing process theater to make leadership feel better. It certainly shouldn't be a central IT team protecting a platform from the very business it's supposed to serve. Instead, governance should give the business the room it needs to build while ensuring those solutions don't quietly increase risk, duplicate effort, or break trust 6 months down the line. Leaders need to stop framing this as a choice between total central control and absolute chaos. That is a false choice that ignores how work actually happens. We already know what chaos looks like because we've spent this entire episode dissecting it. It looks like critical processes living in spreadsheets, work being routed through personal inboxes, and a few exhausted people holding the company together through sheer memory. But total central control isn't the answer either, because when every minor change request enters the same massive queue, the work simply moves back into the shadows in the form of a workaround. What actually works is treating governance as a way to define lanes for the business. It's about being clear on who can build, where they can build, and what specific data they are allowed to touch. You define which connectors are safe, what moves freely through the system, and exactly what requires a formal review. By defining what counts as low risk versus what crosses into enterprise-level risk, you aren't creating a restriction. You are providing the clarity that reduces fear for everyone involved. When you have that clarity, business teams stop guessing whether they are allowed to solve their own problems. IT stops worrying that every local improvement will eventually become an untracked liability that they have to fix later. Security stops discovering critical data exposures after the damage is already done. And support teams stop inheriting orphan solutions that no one can explain. Now map that logic to a company like Contoso. If the procurement team wants to improve a low-risk intake process, the governance model should immediately show them their lane. It tells them to use a specific environment, stick to approved data sources, and follow a naming standard so the solution is searchable. It also gives them a clear escalation path if that process ever starts touching finance policy or regulated data. That is a much healthier model than making a team wait 6 months for a developer or forcing them to build in private and hope nobody notices. There is another reason this matters that people often miss. Good governance protects the builders, not just the platform. When a business team creates an automation without standards or lifecycle rules, the risk doesn't just sit with the company. It sits squarely on the person who built it. That person becomes the accidental owner, the accidental support desk, and the accidental risk carrier for that tool. Then, when something inevitably breaks, the organization acts surprised that a bit of local initiative turned into a massive local liability. Governance prevents that by setting a professional boundary. It tells your people that if they build within these specific patterns, the solution can survive and thrive even after they move to a different role. This is structural compensation working in the right direction. Instead of people constantly compensating for a weak architecture, the architecture starts compensating for normal human limits like people going on leave or priorities shifting. Good governance assumes these changes will happen and builds a safer path before the pressure arrives. And this is why I believe mature governance actually increases speed over the long term. It won't be faster than a single reckless shortcut in the first hour, but shortcuts are always a trap. At the level that actually matters to a business, repeated delivery across dozens of teams, governance removes the hesitation and the cleanup. It gives builders a known path and gives leaders a way to scale confidence instead of scaling anxiety. If your company still treats governance as the no team, I would challenge that perspective directly. Governance should be the very thing that lets more of your people build safely. Why zoned governance is the right stance now? If we accept that governance is a guardrail rather than a brake, we have to ask what kind of model actually fits the modern workplace. My answer is zoned governance. We have to move away from the idea of one rule for everything or open access for everyone. This matters now more than ever because most organizations are currently living in two different realities at the same time. On paper, they talk as if every digital delivery is centrally controlled. but in practice, the business is already building, automating, and using AI to generate logic faster than any old review model can handle. That gap between policy and reality is exactly where bad architecture spreads like a virus. A zoned model accepts a truth that central control models keep trying to resist. Not every solution carries the same level of risk. A departmental request tracker is simply not the same thing as an enterprise approval process that touches finance controls. If we govern a simple notification flow with the same weight as an app handling regulated data, we either slow low-risk work to a crawl or we undergovern the high-risk stuff. Both of those options are failures of leadership. The better stance is to define your lanes based on risk, visibility, and business impact. A green zone gives business teams the room they need to experiment inside safe boundaries with approved connectors and clear ownership. The goal here isn't to remove control, but to place that control at the boundary rather than inside every tiny decision. As a solution starts to touch sensitive data or a wider audience, the governance expectations naturally increase. You add more review and more involvement from security because the blast radius of a failure is much larger. That isn't red tape, it's just good operating design. Think about how this looks at Contoso. A local team improving their own intake process shouldn't have to wait behind the same gate as a company-wide procurement system tied to audit thresholds. At the same time, that procurement system shouldn't live in the same loose lane as a personal productivity app. Zoned governance gives each of those solutions a path that actually fits its purpose. I call this structured autonomy because autonomy without zones eventually becomes sprawl, and control without zones always becomes a backlog. This is especially critical right now because AI has fundamentally changed the speed of creation. Tools like Copilot and agentic features have drastically reduced the effort required to generate complex flows and apps. While that is exciting, it also means that weak design choices can now scale faster than ever before. A bad approval path built slowly is a headache, but a bad approval path generated in seconds and copied across the entire company is a catastrophe. In an AI-shaped environment, zoned governance stops being a nice-to-have maturity step and becomes basic hygiene. The business needs places where experimentation is safe, and IT needs visibility into where that experimentation ends and enterprise responsibility begins. Security needs risk boundaries that reflect how people actually use the tools, not just what is written in an idealized policy document. Most importantly, builders need to know they can solve a problem without accidentally turning themselves into an unplanned support desk for the next 2 years. Zoned governance fits this moment because it reflects the reality of how we work. It assumes people will build, it accepts that not every project needs a full architectural review, and it creates a way to scale without forcing every single problem into one giant queue. But once you see this clearly, you realize one thing: a model like this does not run itself. Someone has to define those zones and watch the platform as it grows, which is exactly where a center of excellence stops being an option and starts being a requirement. What a Power Platform Center of Excellence actually does. Once we accept that zoned governance is the only logical stance, we have to avoid the next common mistake, which is imagining the center of excellence as a distant control tower sitting inside IT and issuing rules to everyone else. That model looks clean on an organizational chart, but it almost always fails in a real company because it creates a disconnect between the people making the rules and the people doing the work. A Power Platform Center of Excellence only works when it behaves less like a gatekeeper and more like a cross-functional operating function that connects platform management, business demand, and security needs in one place. Otherwise, it just becomes another queue or another layer of review that people will inevitably root around as soon as the pressure to deliver rises. And then we are right back where we started, with a fragmented system. So what does a functioning COE actually do in a business reality? First, it manages the platform as shared infrastructure rather than a collection of individual projects. This means that environments, connector policies, access patterns, and monitoring are handled with intent instead of being left to drift over time. The goal here isn't to centralize every single build, but rather to ensure the ground people are building on stays stable and governable as adoption grows across the company. Second, it defines policy in a way that builders can actually use in their daily work. We aren't talking about 50-page PDF documents that no one reads, but rather clear lanes and data rules that answer practical questions. A maker needs to know if they can build in a team environment, which connectors are safe to use, and who owns the app after they move to a different role. Good governance translates high-level risk into operating decisions that people can follow without needing to schedule a meeting every time they want to start a flow. Third, the COE enables people, which is a part of the system that matters more than many leaders expect. A COE isn't just there to prevent bad outcomes, it exists to increase the number of people who can build safely by providing training, office hours, and templates. If every team has to figure out naming standards and support models from scratch, the platform will fragment quickly, even if everyone has good intentions. By providing reusable patterns and approved templates for common apps, the COE reduces both hesitation and the constant reinvention of the wheel. These things might sound like small details until you try to operate without them, and then every build becomes a custom negotiation that simply does not scale. Fourth, it creates visibility so the organization can shift the conversation from rumors to actual evidence. Instead of asking around to find out who built what, the COE uses inventories and usage analytics to understand exactly what is happening on the platform. This matters because invisible growth is where trust starts to erode, whereas visible growth is something that leadership can actually shape and support. Without this visibility, you are stuck governing retrospectively, which means you're always cleaning up after a risk appears or investigating after sprawl has already taken over. Finally, the COE acts as the bridge between business speed and enterprise accountability. The business needs to solve process problems quickly, but IT needs the platform to remain supportable, and security needs clear risk boundaries. The COE sits in the middle of those competing pressures and gives that tension a structure instead of pretending it doesn't exist. When people ask me what a center of excellence actually does, I tell them it makes business-led building visible, supportable, and safe enough to scale. Without that specific function, zoned governance is just a slide in a deck, but with it, the platform becomes a resilient operating model. The business case for governed adoption. Once the center of excellence enters the picture, leadership usually asks what this actually changes in business terms rather than just platform language. This is where the case for governance gets much stronger because governed adoption isn't just a soft maturity idea. It actually changes throughput and risk in ways that executives already care about. Organizations with mature centers of excellence report 67% faster solution delivery and 72% better security posture, which proves that you can be faster and safer at the same time. Many leadership teams still assume that governance slows things down, but in practice, it is poor governance that creates the drag through rework, cleanup, and late-stage interventions. Good governance removes that drag by creating a system where speed is sustainable. Speed in a company isn't just about building one thing quickly, it is about building 1,000 things without constantly creating new layers of uncertainty. If every automation has to be rediscovered or rescued later, you aren't actually moving fast, you're just borrowing time from the future and calling it acceleration. A mature COE changes that pattern by creating reusable lanes and support paths so that delivery gets faster because fewer decisions have to be reinvented every single time. The second part of the business case is reducing risk through enablement rather than through fear or restriction. Training and structured support can reduce security risk by 40 to 50% in mature models, which points to a truth that many leaders often miss. Risk doesn't rise just because people are building things, it rises when they build without context, review paths, or clarity on where the boundaries are. Once you give those same builders approved patterns and visible environments, that decentralized energy becomes a productive asset instead of a liability. Now, compare that to the unguided version where environments face 3 to 4 times higher rates of sprawl and security violations. And that isn't just a small penalty, it is a structural warning that the platform will eventually fail to meet executive expectations. The question is never whether people can build useful solutions, because they obviously can, but whether those solutions stay defensible once adoption spreads across every department. Without governance, the answer eventually drifts toward no, and once that happens, executive confidence drops and funding for the platform begins to dry up. If we map this back to a company like Contoso, we can see how the system would play out over time. Without a COE, procurement might improve one workflow while finance automates another, and for a few months that looks like real progress. However, the same old patterns eventually return in a new shape, leading to duplicate flows, unclear ownership, and hidden dependencies that cause the architecture to fragment. But with governed adoption, those improvements start compounding because one approval pattern informs the next, and one environment model supports the next team. That is what executives should really be buying when they invest in the Power Platform. They aren't just buying apps or flows, they are buying a repeatable way to increase delivery capacity without multiplying their hidden technical risk. If I were sitting at the leadership table, I would tell them plainly that governance is not a cost center attached to low code. It is the fundamental condition that makes low code trustworthy enough to scale across the entire enterprise. Once the platform is trustworthy, the business stops treating every solution like a one-off experiment and starts treating governed delivery as a core part of their normal operating capability. The economics, from hidden labor to measurable return. Once leadership starts viewing governance as a way to protect throughput, the financial questions always follow closely behind. Executives want to know what this costs and what the return looks like, which is a fair question, but it usually enters the room attached to a very misleading comparison. Excel looks cheap because the license is already paid for, the files are familiar, and email is already running, so nobody has to request a new platform budget just to keep a shadow system alive. Because of that, the organization mistake the visible cost for the full cost. It isn't. The spreadsheet itself is cheap, but the operating model required to keep that spreadsheet functioning is incredibly expensive. That is the distinction we have to make. When a procurement cycle takes 9 days instead of 2, someone is paying for that delay. And when rework climbs above 20%, the business is paying for that repetition. Whether it's finance reconciling inconsistent versions or managers chasing status updates manually, that labor is real even if it never shows up on a software invoice. The business has simply pushed the process cost into people's time and management's attention. This is exactly why file-based logic survives as long as it does. Its waste is distributed across the company, so no single line item looks dramatic enough to trigger an alarm, yet the total drag on the system remains. Because this drag sits inside ordinary work, companies eventually normalize it and call it coordination, or just how things work here. If you look at it structurally, this is just hidden labor being used to keep a weak architecture on life support. Now compare that to the Power Platform. Tools like Power Automate and Power Apps introduce an explicit cost through premium licensing, implementation effort, and the need for a center of excellence. This spend is much easier to see, which naturally makes executives more skeptical, but that visibility is actually a massive advantage for the business case. The organization is finally converting hidden, unmanaged waste into a measurable investment that can actually be optimized. A hidden cost never gets improved because nobody owns it, but a visible platform cost forces you to ask if you're getting a return on the architecture you're funding. In most cases, the answer is a resounding yes. Research on Power Platform scenarios shows a 206% ROI over 3 years, with the system often paying for itself in about 6 months. High-impact users can save up to 250 hours a year, and even if your company lands below those top numbers, the direction is clear. Once you move manual routing and status chasing into a governed flow, you open up real labor capacity. I want leaders to hear this clearly. This isn't about reducing headcount. It is about stopping the company from burning its most skilled people on low-trust coordination tasks. If your finance analysts spend hours every week manually reconciling spreadsheets, or if operations managers are stuck chasing approvals, that is a direct loss of system capacity. The return on governed architecture comes from restoring that capacity, so people can focus on work that actually moves the business forward. Look at the Contoso example again. Before the redesign, procurement looked cheap because the file was free, but the process was bleeding money through elapsed time and investigation effort. After the redesign, the process carried a platform cost, but it bought back flow, trust, and management bandwidth. That is a completely different economic story than simply replacing Excel with a more expensive tool. The better framing is that Excel hides operational waste inside the salary lines you've already approved, while a governed Power Platform makes that investment visible enough to manage. Cheap tools that drive expensive behavior are not actually cheap, and governed platforms with measurable returns are not actually expensive. They are accountable. In a business under pressure to move faster without adding more overhead, accountable architecture is always the better deal. Security and compliance, the risk you already have. This is usually the point where someone speaks up and says that the Power Platform increases security and compliance risk. I understand that reaction because a new platform with more builders and more connectors sounds like you're introducing exposure the company didn't have before. But from a system perspective, that framing is completely backwards because the exposure is already there. The only difference is that right now in your Excel shadow systems, that exposure sits in places the company cannot see or govern. Files move through email, attachments get downloaded to local drives, and access depends entirely on who forwarded what to whom. When approval evidence is scattered between a spreadsheet, a mailbox, and someone's personal memory, you have a system with 3 different storage models for one single process. When leaders tell me they're worried about the risk of a new platform, I think we need to translate the current state of their safe spreadsheets honestly. You have no clean audit trail, weak access logic, uncontrolled file sharing, and manual workarounds for every official process. That isn't a low-risk environment, it is unmanaged risk with a familiar brand name, and we often mistake familiarity for safety. Think back to the Contoso procurement process before we fixed it. Requests arrived as attachments, approvals happened in long email threads, and clarifications were buried in hallway conversations. Different people held different copies of the same request, meaning finance might be reviewing one version while procurement looked at another. If an auditor asks for a reliable sequence of events, the company has to reconstruct the answer after the fact, but reconstruction is not control, it's compensation. This matters even more as we head into 2026 because file-based workflows are getting hit by operational fragility and security exposure at the same time. Research into Excel automation shows growing weaknesses in unmanaged file logic, ranging from macro threats to new attack paths inside Office environments. Even without a dramatic threat model, if a critical process depends on scattered files and weak traceability, your security is already below the level you think it is. The risk doesn't start when the Power Platform enters the room. The risk simply becomes visible when governed architecture arrives. Governed systems don't remove the need for security discipline, but they do raise the standard by providing logging, policy enforcement, and environment controls. You finally get a place to define which connectors are acceptable and which data can move where, shifting the conversation from vague concern to intentional design. Instead of asking if something might be risky, the company can finally ask who has access, what data it touches, and where the audit record lives. Mature organizations lower their risk by refusing to tolerate invisible architecture. There is a real irony in companies rejecting governed platforms in the name of compliance while they continue to run billion-dollar processes through email attachments. From a system perspective, that isn't caution, it's a misclassification of reality. They are labeling the visible platform as risky while treating the invisible, unmanaged workaround as normal. But that invisible workaround is already your breach surface, your audit weakness, and your retention problem. The executive stance should be simple. Don't compare a governed platform to an imagined secure version of the present. Compare it to the actual messy process you have running right now. If you do that honestly, the conclusion changes fast. The question isn't whether the Power Platform introduces risk, but whether it gives you the first real chance to govern the risk you're already carrying. Why identity and access matter more than most teams think. Once security enters the conversation, identity becomes the next layer that most teams still underestimate. A governed process is not just about where the logic runs, but it is also about who can trigger it, who can see the data, and who keeps access when their job description changes. If those decisions stay loose, automation will expand your reach much faster than your accountability can keep up. The workflow might look cleaner on the surface, but the control model underneath it remains dangerously weak. This is where Microsoft Entra ID matters far more than many business teams realize. A lot of organizations still treat identity as background infrastructure like a login or a password, but when you start building real process architecture on Power Platform, identity stops being background noise. It becomes the access backbone for your entire operating model, where role-based access and lifecycle control determine whether the process reflects business reality or quietly drifts away from it. Now map that to the situation at Contoso. In the old Excel pattern, access depended entirely on distribution, meaning if you had the file or the mail thread, you often had more visibility than you actually should. If someone forwarded a spreadsheet to help move the work along, access expanded informally without any oversight. If a manager changed roles but stayed on an old email thread, they still carried context they no longer needed, and the process simply inherited the looseness of email behavior. That is not access control, that is access residue. In a governed model, identity changes the fundamental question from who has the file to who should have access based on their role and current responsibility. While that sounds obvious, it changes everything because a requester can track their own item without seeing unrelated requests, and a manager can approve items strictly within their span of control. Finance can review cases based on specific thresholds, while procurement administers the workflow, and platform admins can support the environment without gaining casual access to business data they do not need. That is a stronger model because access finally starts reflecting operating reality. And why does that matter more as we head into 2026? Modern authentication and MFA enforcement are becoming less optional across the Microsoft estate as legacy authentication is phased out. Security defaults and stronger signing controls are becoming the normal expectation rather than a sign of advanced maturity. So if a company keeps building logic on top of inherited access habits, the friction will only grow. This is not because Microsoft is being difficult, but because the old trust model no longer matches the risk surface of modern work. This matters even more once automation starts acting across your different systems. A flow can send approvals and update records in the background, but if the identity model under that automation is vague, the blast radius grows quietly. People can end up with access that outlives their role. And service connections can become invisible dependencies that nobody is tracking. When something fails or exposes data, the business discovers too late that it automated the movement of information without automating the accountability behind it. From a system perspective, weak identity turns automation into unmanaged reach, while strong identity turns it into governed execution. That is the distinction. When I look at Power Platform architecture, I do not see Entra ID as a technical add-on, but rather as a vital part of the control plane. It decides whether the process can enforce least necessary access and whether risky conditions should trigger stronger controls when a user signs in. It ensures that role changes actually reshape who can do what inside the flow, which has direct business implications for how you handle your data. Audit readiness improves because access is tied to policy instead of habit, and your security posture gets stronger because approval rights are not floating around in old threads. Operational resilience improves because when people move or leave the company, their access moves with governance instead of staying behind as residue. Once AI enters the platform, this requirement gets even sharper because agents and copilots can act quickly, but they should never outrun the identity rules that define what they are allowed to touch. If your access is loose, AI will simply scale that loose access. If your identity is governed, AI operates inside much clearer boundaries. The business case is simple. If your process architecture is going to become more automated and more intelligent, then identity cannot stay an afterthought. It has to become part of the design because without identity discipline, automation expands faster than trust, and AI will only amplify that architectural weakness. AI does not remove the need for architecture, it amplifies it. Once AI enters the platform, a lot of leaders start assuming the hard part of the job is over. They see Copilot generate an app draft or suggest a flow, and they think the platform has suddenly become self-solving. The assumption is understandable, but I think the opposite is true. When creation gets easier, your architecture actually matters more. AI reduces the effort required to produce logic, but it does not reduce the need for that logic to be good. It reduces the time between an idea and its implementation, but it does not reduce the consequences of a weak design. If anything, AI removes the friction that used to slow bad decisions down, which means the business can now generate flawed workflows and unsafe data interactions much faster than before. That is why I keep coming back to the point that AI does not remove your design responsibility. It simply compresses the distance between the quality of your design and the business impact it creates. Now map that back to the reality at Contoso. In the old world, building a poor workaround still took some effort because someone had to shape the spreadsheet and explain the steps to keep the file alive. While that was fragile, it was at least slow enough to contain itself for a while. But in an AI-assisted world, a manager can describe a need in plain language and get a version 1.0 immediately. A team can spin up an agent that appears useful before anyone has asked the important questions about ownership or lifecycle. The surface gets smoother, but the risk gets faster. And why is that? AI is an acceleration layer rather than a governance layer, so while it helps people create, it does not automatically classify risk well enough for enterprise use. It does not reliably understand your internal control model, and it certainly does not decide whether a process belongs in a protected green zone or a standard enterprise lane. It does not own the consequences when generated logic reaches production with weak assumptions baked into it, because that responsibility still belongs to us. Organizations often make a very expensive mistake by confusing fluency with fit. If an AI tool can build something that looks coherent, they assume it fits the operating reality of the business. But process architecture is not just about producing something that runs. It is about producing something the company can trust and govern under pressure. A generated approval flow may look neat, but that does not mean the escalation path is right, and a Copilot-built app may collect data cleanly without the data boundary being correct. From a system perspective, AI exposes weak architecture faster than manual methods ever could. It reveals where your policies are vague and where your ownership is unclear, showing exactly where data structures were never stable enough to support automation safely. This is why the 2026 direction inside Power Platform matters so much, as the move toward agentic governance and real-time risk assessment is a direct response to a new condition where creation is outrunning old review models. If the business can generate apps and agents faster than the organization can understand them, then governance has to become more embedded and continuous. It shouldn't be slower, but it definitely needs to be smarter. For any leader listening, I would frame it this way. If your architecture is weak, AI will not hide that weakness, it will scale it. If your boundaries are vague, AI will operate inside that vagueness at high speed. If your ownership model is missing, AI will simply multiply your unsupported assets. However, if your governance is mature, AI becomes a force multiplier for good patterns and clearer observability. That is why this first episode has to land here. Before we talk about AI ambition or prompt-driven building, you have to focus on architecture, because the platform will now let you build faster than your instincts were trained to govern. And if you do not fix that first, you will not get an intelligent operating model. You will just get smarter shadow systems. Where to start without doing too much at once? So after looking at the big picture, the practical question becomes very simple. Where do you actually start without triggering another wave of chaos? This is where many organizations overcorrect because they finally see the shadow system problem and decide to launch a massive transformation program. They open too many threads at once and end up creating a second coordination mess while trying to fix the first one. The intent is good, but the design is fundamentally wrong. You do not start by trying to fix everything. Instead, you start with one single process that gives you a clear signal. That process needs to sit in a very specific zone where you have high friction and high volume, but only low to medium complexity. It should already be painful enough that nobody will argue about whether it actually matters. You want something visible and repeatable that stays close enough to the business so people can feel the improvement quickly. Approval chains, request intake, or status tracking are usually better first candidates than large enterprise redesigns. These smaller processes expose architecture problems clearly without demanding a full rewrite of your operating model on day one. Now, let's map that logic back to the Contoso example. The procurement approval path worked well as a first move, not because procurement is magical, but because it met the right structural conditions. The demand was frequent, the pain was visible, and the logic was easy for everyone to understand. All the failure signals were already there in the form of long cycle times, constant rework, and weak audit trails. This gave the business a clean place to test a governed redesign without pretending they had to solve every broken process at once. That distinction matters. If the first use case you pick is too large, too political, or too ambiguous, the organization will learn the wrong lesson from a difficult start. People will confuse poor scoping with a weakness in the platform itself. To avoid that, I would keep your entry criteria very tight. Pick one process where the volume is regular enough to measure and the pain is already accepted as a reality. You also need to make sure the ownership can be named clearly and the data boundary stays manageable. Most importantly, the result must be visible inside 90 days. That last part is vital because the first build should do more than just improve the work. It needs to teach the company how governed improvement actually feels. If the business has to wait a year to understand whether the new model works, old habits will simply rush back in to fill the gap. Before you build anything, you need to baseline 3 specific things. First, look at cycle time. You need to know how long the process actually takes from submission to completion in a lab's business reality, not just in theory. Second, measure the rework rate. Find out how often the same request gets corrected, resent, or rechecked because the state of the data was weak the first time. Third, look at the audit pain. Note how often different teams disagree on status, numbers, or who actually owns the evidence. Those 3 signals give you a before state that carries real executive relevance. They also stop the project from drifting into those vague, empty claims about modernization. You aren't trying to look more digital, you're trying to remove measurable architectural waste. To keep things on track, you must keep the delivery model disciplined. You need one owner, one governed environment, and one success dashboard. That is enough. You don't need 5 parallel pilots or a broad invitation for everyone to start building at once. You just need one contained use case with clear responsibility and visible metrics. While that first use case goes live, pay attention to something most teams completely miss. Do not just admire the solution, but make sure you capture the pattern. Look at what intake fields were required and what routing logic proved to be reusable. Figure out which naming conventions and review steps worked so you can turn them into a template for the next exception path. The first build should become a repeatable design asset rather than a one-off success story that people celebrate and then quietly fail to reuse. That is how you begin to scale safely. You prove one lane works and then you make that lane easier for the next person to walk. If you are wondering where to begin, my answer is plain. Do not start with the biggest transformation you can find. Start with the clearest friction. Choose one process that already hurts, measure it honestly, and rebuild it inside a governed boundary. Treat that result as the first pattern in a much larger operating model. When the architecture improves in one visible place, the company finally gets evidence that better flow is possible without losing control. Once that happens, the next step is no longer just another isolated fix. It becomes a new way to run your entire delivery system. The operating model leaders should adopt next. If we pull all of this together, the operating model leaders need next is not led by apps. It is governance-led, process-owned, and platform-enabled. That distinction is important because too many organizations still sponsor individual solutions instead of sponsoring the conditions that let good solutions repeat. One app will not fix the invisible company, and one automation will not fix hidden coordination. One dashboard will never restore trust if the operating model underneath it still depends on scattered ownership and reactive delivery. Leadership has to sponsor the model itself, and that starts with the executive role. Executives should not spend their energy choosing which small app gets attention next. Their real job is to back the governance stance, fund the platform conditions, and make it clear that business-led improvement must happen inside visible rules. If leadership only funds isolated wins, the company just gets pockets of improvement. If leadership funds the model, the company gets a compounding capability that grows over time. In this new world, IT has a different job than it had in the old central queue model. IT should own the guardrails. This means they handle identity, environment strategy, lifecycle control, and connector policies. They set the standards and the support paths. That is real ownership, but it is not ownership of every single process decision. IT keeps the platform trustworthy, but they do not need to remain the author of every local fix. The business role changes as well. Business teams need to own the process logic, the outcome, and the priority for improvement. They are the ones who know where the friction sits and where the handoffs break. They know which approvals create useless noise and which exceptions keep repeating. If they stay outside of solution ownership, the architecture will eventually drift away from the real work again. The operating model becomes a true partnership. The business owns the problem, while IT owns the platform conditions and security shapes the boundaries. A center of excellence connects those layers so delivery does not collapse back into the politics of handoffs. This is why fusion team logic matters here. It isn't just a trend word, it is a practical correction. When domain knowledge and platform discipline work together early, the business gets faster solutions that actually survive contact with reality. When they work separately, one side creates theory and the other creates workarounds. If you want to know whether your operating model is working, do not start by counting the number of apps you've built. Look for different signs. Look for less waiting, less rework, and more trust in the numbers. You should see fewer heroic individuals carrying an undocumented process load. That is the real shift. The company stops depending on structural compensation from exhausted people and starts getting structural resilience from a better architecture. If you look closely, the real move here is not from Excel to the Power Platform. It is a move from invisible dependency to governed flow. Once leaders understand that, they stop asking what tool they should roll out next. They start asking the better question: what operating model lets this business improve without rebuilding fragility every single quarter? That if you audited your process architecture the same way you audit your systems, you would likely find a business running on invisible dependencies and trust held together by memory. This isn't a personal failing of your team, but rather a system outcome of how we've built our workflows over time. If this gave you a clearer frame for what Excel is actually doing inside your company, leave a review for the podcast and connect with me, Mirko Peters, on LinkedIn. Send me the next topic you want me to break down, and let's figure out if your systems are designed to sustain you or slowly drain you.